Hi, I'm Jordan.
And I'm Doyle. And there's some things I got to say tonight. Last time when we chatted, Jordan, we talked about this silly example that I posed about throwing a punch and a right to throw a punch, and as long as it to the end of your nose, and we talked through that, and sort of what that, how that, how we viewed that, and how we define, sort of the authority to do certain things, and then we talked about personal freedom to do the things you want as long as it doesn't harm someone else. And you have a right to potentially harm yourself with some of these choices that a person might make.
Sure.
But I wanted us to chat a little bit tonight about a more fundamental aspect of this authority or this privilege or this right to do things that we choose to do and want to do, and sort of talk about what they are, where did they originate, and why they matter. The we talked last time about the freedom to be able to make one's own choices about things that you do, even if someone else disagrees with it, as long as it doesn't harm someone, right? And we talked a good bit about harm, but why does that why does that matter? Why does that apply? And I think it begins with a real fundamental human right. This is not anything about the laws or the statutes or anything that's been codified anywhere. It's just that by virtue of the fact of our existence, there are freedoms that humans have. Right? They have a right to survive. Right? They have a right to eat. They have a right to any number of, and breathe any number of different things. Um, uh, uh, and it extends well beyond that into just choices, things that aren't necessarily necessary for life, but are elections and choices that someone does. And where do those go, and how far can they go, and why do they go, right? And I think it has to do with a person making a distinction between for themselves what's right and wrong, right? And I think there are universal ways of looking at right and wrong, and I'm not talking about cultural or societal. I'm talking about at the most basic human level. No matter if someone is uh, was born in the United States or born in some third world country or some you know native uh, tribe that is never been civilized, and they just live the way they lived, 1,000 years ago. Uh, there are those things that are accepted as right and well known what's wrong, right? You don't kill someone else, right? You don't take property or take something that someone has without their permission, right? There's I don't think many people would ever argue that those are pretty clearly wrong things, um, uh, uh, but there
No,
are
I think
degrees.
I disagree. There's lots of people who don't believe in things like uh, property rights, for example, and that's one of the things that I do want to talk about tonight when we get into it. So I think it's more than you might imagine, and
Sure.
that's
Okay.
and I'm not saying that it's a majority or a plurality or anything like that. It's just it's more than you would think. I believe more than I ever thought.
I certainly will not. I certainly will acknowledge that and not try to argue that, because I look at things from the perspective of assuming positive intent
Sure,
by
sure.
most people, right? And not everyone does, right? And so I think if someone doesn't assume positive intent, then they're going to be more suspicious, and it might lead them to define right and wrong differently than I do, and differently than I would think that many other people do as well. Um,
I don't
but
mean
what
to
is it?
detract from your point, though. That I would say many would have fallen in line with what you've said.
Yeah, and so how do we know what's right, right? And obviously, if something's, we can define what's right, uh, starting with what's not wrong. I mean, by understanding what's wrong and then saying everything that's not wrong is obviously okay to be right. When I say right, I don't mean a right to do something. I mean right in the sense of it's uh, a person's freedom to act the way they choose and want to act. And when I start thinking about all of this stuff, you start thinking about it's hard to separate. For me, it's hard to separate this whole basic view totally from society, right?
Sure.
And in the United States, one of the things that most people and I know I do immediately go to is, well, what has this country and our society, how have they um, acknowledged our rights? And I think we mentioned last time, and I was ashamed that I didn't know which document this particular phrase came from, the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, but it definitely was from the Declaration of Independence. It's actually the second paragraph, and I'll just in part that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's real easy to go and latch onto as the origin of rights, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which are pretty broad. Um,
I want to actually just 1 second, one piece of trivia to put in here because it's important to the point that I'm going to make. That's a revising of that document. That's the original Declaration of Independence. Don't get me wrong, but that's not what Thomas Jefferson wrote. He wrote "Pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property," and it got
ah,
edited to "the pursuit of happiness." So I've just a little tidbit for later.
sure, sure. And so I know to me, the way that is a solid way, solid foundation to discuss the origin of freedoms and rights. Speaking of now, rights being the things that you're free to do, is think about they come from a creator, our creator, right? And I know not everyone embraces that. Some people don't believe there is a quote unquote singular creator of our existence. But I happen to, and it drives a lot of my value system. Um, and so with that, then that's not something. If we're endowed with these unalienable rights by our Creator, then our Creator is the only one that can take them away, or we can surrender them ourselves. Right? No one else, in my estimation, according to that definition, has the authority to limit or remove those rights. So that said, I think that is what drives my view of right versus wrong. The everything that doesn't do harm is a freedom and a right that we as human beings have a fundamental human right to embrace and to execute and to live and to do.
It's that's a position that I find hard to argue with because um, while I don't personally um, come to that same conclusion, I come to the same conclusion, but I don't come to the same conclusion through the same path. I think that there's that your construction there is fine. There would be some things that I would want to call out, um, particularly. Well, it's losing in my mind here. um, I think it's good. I think that one of the points that I wanted to make is that yes, our documents that were all around the formation of the United States are I think are very important, are relevant. I think they're mainly important and relevant because they're uh, based upon principles that came even well before those individuals wrote about them. Um,
Right.
I think that's why those documents are important versus taking and this is not against what you're saying. This is just taking another
Mhm.
perspective and kind of expanding on it. A lot of people want to make the argument or at least take the position that those statements from Declaration of Independence, even the Constitution, Articles of Confederation, and even the Federalist Papers, Common Sense, a lot of the writings of that time, a lot of them want to, have this sort of, I think, a little bit of a rose-colored look at the past and say that was a better time, and these were men that should be revered by simply the fact that they said these things at this time and led to the creation of this country. I think that is an unfortunate position, because it deifies them to a degree that really limits the efficacy of the and even the gravity and the profundity of the things that they were saying, because they were humans and they didn't come up with these ideas on their own, right? They
Right.
some had original ideas. I'm not trying to disclaim that, but they're greatly more organizers of ideas, that because they were all well studied, right? And lots of, and certainly in most of the Western tradition, and even some beyond that. And so that's why, for me, when it comes to the idea of rights, I find that that's too limiting of a origin. And I'm not saying that you're claiming that the origin comes from those people. I just want to say,
Right.
make that statement about that, because I know many people really do feel and believe that way. And I would love to talk to people like that, because I want to have a real genuine conversation with them, because I think at least that sort of person who's thinking along those lines is usually, I know this isn't always the case, but usually, kind of, rational and open for rational discourse. And that's an important basis to start any kind of discussion that's going to go anywhere. But for me, the formulation of rights comes from what I think is a fundamental desire in all people, namely the desire for peace. And I think that it's sadly unfortunate that the desire for peace in today's time has been cast as selfishness, craven individuality, disregard for people and for society. And it's like, no, the desire for peace is the desire for peace. And so the only way that peace can be maintained in any size society of humans is there have to be some sort of organizing principle that all agree upon as a mechanism to maintain that peace. And a lot of that, and this is going back to your whole idea about the property and people believing that, you should be entitled to have your property or whatever. That in fact, and almost in totality, is the basis of my perspective, is that your rights are based in the concept of property rights, that there exists property that is there is a moral mechanism, or maybe ethical is a better word, but I would use the word moral mechanism to justly acquire and justly possess property. And the working out of those property rights and the agreements around them, contracts, trade, all that kind of stuff, is what keeps peace. And we need property, because if we didn't, then you're going to immediately have conflict, because it's going to be like, well, no, that's mine. I'm holding on to it. Well, no, you just took it from me. It was mine. I created it, I know you're not aware of this meme, but I want to make a mention of this meme. This one isn't a real profound meme or anything like some of them can be, or I say profound, just insightful. This one is just kind of like a truism. It's just like a hand-drawn comic, and maybe a comic's better to call it than a meme, because it doesn't really have many variations. But like somebody has like this weird looking thing in their hand, looks like almost like a toy spaceship or something, and they say, "I made this." And there's another person with them there that they're saying this to, and they're like showing it to them, and the person picks it up and they said, "You made this?" and then the person's like, I made this, and then the other person walks away, and so the person that they gave it to has it in their hand, and they look at it, and then they say, I made this. And it's like, it's so silly, but it's like, it's such a I think an insightful sort of comment. It's supposed to be just pure humor, because like that's what happens
Hmm.
on the internet, right? People make something, put
Right.
it out there, and then someone just take it like, oh, this was me, because you can just like relabel or whatever. But I think that it's a deeper insight than just that. I think it's an insight into some level of humanity, that some people aren't driven by deeper principles and honor and things along those lines. And I don't know. I would recommend that people like that become principled and be driven by things like honor, but I don't think that there's a necessary requirement for them to, because if you have a concept like property rights, then you can abstract away that need.
Hmm.
And so for me, property is the most right to justly acquire and possess property is the most fundamental right, because from that you extrapolate that you own yourself, and so you are
Hmm.
your own property. Who else would have such a just claim? I mean, you can make arguments about a parent when a kid is a kid, but I mean that's a special case if we're talking about society, and not an
But
uncommon case, but special.
well, one could argue that that's not a property; that is a stewardship
I think that's a
situation, right?
better
Which
way
is
to
different.
conceptualize it.
Yeah,
Yes, I agree with you
yeah.
100%.
Um,
Um, but my point being, though, just and I'll turn over to you in just
mhm.
a second. But I think everything thus emanates from property rights, because once you agree that you need property rights, and then you agree that you own yourself, you can basically derive any other right that you can imagine, because most of those are rights in the property of your own person.
Mhm. Yeah, I think your points there certainly are in alignment and dovetail with the simpleton perspective that I had about right versus wrong, right? And what you're talking about, the right, just versus wrong, unjust versus
Sure.
rights, to do, because property is your discussion was it is a just right, just freedom, to have, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, when you said not everyone believes that one, I think one of the quick examples I used was people have a right to eat, right? But you don't have a right to go grab your food. I don't to go grab your food to eat, right?
So
Because that's
yeah, I agree
not
with
that I
you. And that
wouldn't.
was one of the you reminded me. That's one of the things I wanted to take a little bit of an exception with. We have to be careful about the words. This again, I'm not trying to push my perspective on you. I feel like we have to be careful about um, how we say things like that, because if you say someone has the right to eat, well, what about people who don't have food, right?
That does not affect their right to eat. It affects their ability to eat.
I understand, but the
Yeah,
thing is, you have to be very careful and specific with language, because many people will
understood.
take whatever interpretation they want from what you're saying, and I don't mean that from a
Sure.
hey, we gotta be careful and not hurt people's feelings or anything. We want to take care to not hurt people's feelings, but we need to speak what we believe is truth. But the reality of it is, uh, that's a phrase that if it were to, and I'm sure people have already said it, but if it were to really peek its head in the sociological and political climate right now, that would be taken as meaning something very different than what you intended it to mean. And I knew
And
how you intended it.
understood. Understood. I mean, that's another example of that that demonstrates what you're talking about. Is I think people have a right to learn, a right to education,
Sure.
right? And it is uh, uh, the government, not just the United States, but virtually all governments have interpreted that to mean, oh, the government must provide the education.
Right.
So you have a right to education. So the government must provide it to you, or the people must provide it to you through the government.
So is
That's
your
not what
rights
I'm
not
referring.
being guaranteed if not? That's the argument. Is your rights not being
That's
guaranteed
the
if they don't?
that's the argument, correct?
Yeah.
Right. But where that falls short is that then eliminates one right, another right, right? Because not only do they say they provide it, they require it.
Mm-hmm.
which then changes the right, affects the right, which goes to my point about um, from my where I discuss where I think rights come from, where they emanate from. They come from our Creator, and in my case, the God, my God. Um, uh, then no one can restrict, limit, uh, prevent those rights except God or myself, right? Not appropriate, because then it gets into the territory of being wrong. What people do, I believe, and this is where I believe governments with originating with all good intent, but have since created a machinery that permits malintent, is they try to codify by laws and statutes the delivery of things that are deemed to be rights, right? Rather than getting out of the way of those rights and letting those rights be exercised in the most appropriate way by the choice of the people involved, or the individuals, or the humans that are involved. We see that with education. We see
Sure.
that with, any number of different things, right? The where and it just continues, right? And man and governments and legislators and the such are imperfect. So their efforts are flawed. And so the way they deal with their flawed efforts is they continue to act more on the laws and the statutes, right? Because it just amazes me that the simple point of rights are freedom to do what you want to, as long as it's not wrong, um, gets bent over backwards and violated and distorted and many times abridged by the laws that governments try to put in place.
Sure.
Right. I get it, and I'm not arguing about, you know, no order, no guidelines by which people agree to behave, which kind of goes to the point about God can I think our Creator, God can remove, limit, change our rights anytime He chooses to, right? However, God would choose to do so, or we can surrender them ourselves, or we can compromise them ourselves in an attempt to cooperate, an attempt to, you know, search and keep and maintain peace,
Sure.
right? And that's where uh, uh, and I didn't really intend to go down this path when we started this conversation tonight, but it just struck me as I think in terms of, the federal code, right? There's just thousands upon thousands of pages of laws, and they continually are writing new ones all the time, and then they have to interpret the laws because they're so open to interpretation and misinterpretation and
Well,
malinterpretation
they're not even
and
read by the
rules.
legislators.
They're not. And then so you have administrative discussions and documents and such to explain what was originally what they meant, or what they mean now, or what the bureaucrats that are enforcing these laws and new laws and statutes, how they interpret them to be. So there seems to be a massive effort to deal with something that should be much more fundamental and much more straightforward.
Sure, it certainly. I can't disagree with you at all. I think that um, there is an impetus for people generally. This goes well beyond, I think, just politicians. Uh, there's an impetus for people generally to feel like what they're doing matters, and that they're contributing something greater than themselves somewhere. Um, and I'm not gonna be so cynical as to say that no politician is operating that way too, right? They feel that. I think there are certainly some politicians who operate with the sincere belief that what they're doing is helping to make the world better. I think, though, there's a larger amount that don't even think about it that way.
Hmm.
And I think that that's fundamentally wrong. I think that it is a violation of what your position is intended to be when you approach things with such cavalier attitude, such something that should be so serious with such a cavalier attitude. And we can be all high and mighty about it, but the reality is, both you and I know that most politicians are bought and paid for by organizations and
Sure.
individuals and
Sure.
special interests, etc.
Hmm.
And those things are vast and broad ranging, and it's not just evil corrupt corporations, although there are some of those that are
Hmm.
partaking in that. um, and so at some point, we're really pivoting now, but at some point, what is the end, right? It's like a thermodynamics. You're creating more and more and more chaos, more entropy. At some point, you have the heat death of the universe. It's like these systems are going to have their own heat death at some point when they keep going this way. Um, and there's nothing that I don't think that's really going to be able to stop them per se, because they're kind of, you know, um, at a bit of terminal velocity, that's going to be really hard, and it's so massive at that terminal velocity that what could slow it down, what could stop it, right? Um,
All right.
anyway, I'm not really making any real point with this other than just kind of talking about a little bit how I feel about it.
Yeah, and in that vein, as you were saying that, we talked a lot about politicians and elected officials. It's kind of ironic that when someone talks about a big group, whether it be a corporation or some sort of association of some sort, where there's a lot of people and people are jockeying for power and leadership. They
Yeah.
talk about working the politics, right?
Oh, sure.
In kind of a real negative, disparaging kind of way. But the elected officials don't seem to have a problem being called politicians. I would think that would be sort of a disparaging way to be referred to. And I think of an example that I got pretty bold before a recent congressional election, and I was at a Chamber of Commerce meeting where the three candidates that were running for this congressional position attended. Right, so they were given the opportunity to stand in front of the chamber and chamber membership and speak. It was a Friday coffee kind of event, Friday morning coffee, and so they were given 5 or 10 minutes to speak, to make their statement about what they had were going to do. One of the candidates I had met a couple of years earlier, and I won't say I knew him well, but I knew who he was, and had opportunity to meet him and his wife at a different event, not a political event, not an electoral event or anything like that. And I chatted with him, and we were just chit chatting, and I said, and he asked me for my vote, and I said, I'd like to ask you a favor. And he said, what's that? And I said, please be a statesman and not a politician if you get elected. And to me, the difference is the someone that embraces the right versus wrong versus someone that's looking only for personal success. And I
Sure.
mean, he acknowledged, yeah. I said, because we need more statesmen, people that go to represent with the best interests of their electorate and of the citizenry and of the organization that they represent. And sad to say, this individual did not get elected. He didn't win the election, but the three good there were three good candidates. So the one that got elected, I have no real opposition to what how he operates. But it all boils down to, as long as we use the right versus wrong measuring stick, I think it gets simplified. I think every situation that we face, in regard to the ability to do what we want to do, if we look at it through a right versus wrong lens, it becomes pretty much clearer.
I think it does at an individual level, and even at an individual politician level. I take your meaning, but here's the thing that I think again we arise to, or this uh, concept and conflict against peace arises when we talk about something like a statesman or a representative like that in that way,
Hmm.
as you know you could have the um, representative who is the most well-meaning person in the world and is the most diligent and honorable about representing as purely as humanly possible the needs and desires of their constituency in whatever representative body that they are elected to. But there's always going to be those people who their positions and their desires are going to be gone against, no matter how much within that framework of right and wrong, because people have a different interpretation for particularly right and wrong. That's why when you're talking about, I think, some general rights system that has to supersede anyone's own personal ethos, that it has to be so fundamentally basic that on its face, by definition, it can allow everyone to believe how they believe, do what they do, as long as it allows everyone else to do the same, right?
Hmm.
That's again my perspective, and I again I know your point, because we are in the system that we're in. We find ourselves in the
Hmm.
present day, right? And so we have to decide within that context what is the most valuable action or thing to spend our time thinking about, talking about, advocating for, etc. And so I think at any point that basically that's a trade-off, right?
Hmm.
You can't have some sort of purity of position and expect that it's going to be recognized or accommodated or whatever. And I think that's just a realistic thing you have to accept, because as much as we want to talk about all of these deep underlying principles that we have, and I think that it's warranted for us to have them. It's warranted for us to talk about them. I think they're important. I think as soon as we as humans stop talking about them, we are doing our posterity a huge detriment. But as much as we want to talk about that, at the end of the day, you have to decide, okay, so when the rubber meets the road, how do I enact these principles? Or am I just, talking about principles and don't really believe the principles?
Sure. Yeah. And we've had discussions about principles, numerous times in the past, and I think in regard to rights, principles are the rules, I think, by which people try to perform and behave, right? Because that's
Yes.
in
Yeah.
reality what we're talking
And
about
it's
is
separate
is
than rights for
behavior.
sure. No doubt.
Yeah. No, no, but I'm just saying it's the rights are things that in my mind are um, virtually absolute, if that makes any sense in this context. By that I mean, they are. I mean, it's absolutely not even virtual. I should just say it's absolute, right? Because
Sure.
as long as it's not harming someone else, and we talked about different types of harm, like the fear being a type of harm, right? If someone does something and it creates undue fear in someone, that could be crossing the rights line. Um, but there's another dimension to this, I think, from the principle. We're all, and you sort of alluded to this, we're all imperfect humans. Where the rubber meets the road is in our behavior and in the choices and or the compromises or the mistakes that we make, right?
Sure.
I think there's a difference between people that are individuals that are guided by principles that they sometimes fall away from or fall astray from when they know, versus someone that has abandoned the right versus wrong because they've chosen to go a different path,
Yeah.
uh, for personal gain, for whatever reason, right? That they would choose to do that. And I think, obviously that's one area where you need an arbitration, right? If you and I interact, and it's a situation where it's pretty clear what was right to behave between us, and I choose a different path, and it harmed you in some way, you need to have some form of recourse, right, for restitution or retribution or recompense for the harm that was done. And I'm not trying to get into civil tort law conversations. This is more fundamental than that. I mean,
Right.
it's almost biblical in one sense, right? That when you do someone wrong, they are due a payback, not vengeance, not revenge, but recompense, some sort of restitution, restoration to where they were before, right?
Sure.
And
Sure.
and that's something that needs to be arbitrated and mediated, right? You could do it amongst yourselves, possibly, right? If
Sure.
there's a peaceful way to happen that, or it could be done by another party that they either agree to or submit to, right? And
Well, there
I
could
know
be
in biblical
context.
times.
I would say real quick, there could be context in
Mhm.
which that there are already guidelines to resolve that, like bylaws
Sure,
of an organization,
that's right.
or if you're in some
Where
social
people have agreed
group
to it.
where, yeah, a social group where it's like this is how we handle conflict. It's like, okay, we all agree
Mhm.
to it. We're part of this group. All right, this is how we do it.
Right, and which that's when using a Bible story, kind of actually a survey, not really a story, but Moses, when he was leading the Israelites out of bondage, he was the leader, and he was the arbitrator, right? He was the singular arbitrator, and he learned that wouldn't work because it was not restorative sufficiently for the peoples and the things that they needed to have done. And so he put in place the judges, which kind of leads into some of the Old Testament scriptures. The idea being there, that was a method to discern and be restorative of right versus wrong situations that had occurred, to mediate and to arbitrate and to decide how to restore a harmed individual back to their previous state and status. So again, I mean, I know there's people that may not believe in God and believe the Bible, and that's fine. That's their right to do so. But from my perspective, it's part of the source of the principles that I embrace and like to try to live by. And I say like to try because I'm an imperfect human being as well, right? And I think making a mistake of violating your principles is different than abandoning one's principles, and that's sort of the situation that I think I would love for humanity, all of humanity, to embrace operating by. Not necessarily the biblical principles. I don't mean that, but the principles of right
What
and wrong,
what
and no harm.
those are called enlightenment principles. So the whole idea of this, if you subscribe to any kind of Western society or Western view on society, um, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about.
Mhm.
I mean, this is we were talking very loosely around the kind of constitutional law, and I don't mean that in the United States Constitution. I mean like literal
Right,
constitutional law. Um,
right.
and whatnot. All of these systems are based on those enlightenment values. And again, this is not the podcast for this, but I mean these principles and values are under siege from other people that want to throw them out, want to replace with other systems, and the it would be one thing if their tactics were, okay, let's sit down and have a rational discussion and see if maybe there is something better that we can move to, because I'm not under absolutely no delusion that we are in a perfect system or anywhere near it. But I would say all too often those people who want to throw out these values either one don't have anything that they want to replace it with. They just want to burn the system and say, well, it's going to be what it's going to be, or
Hmm.
they want to replace it with a system that won't let you argue with it, or does not even come to the table of rational discussion, and basically says rational discussion is a farce. And I'm sorry, I don't want to live in that society. And if that somehow makes me bigoted, I don't know how it would, but I'll wear that label of bigot if that's really what that means. Because I mean, how do you think that you're ever going to figure out how things should actually be in your society if you can't have some sort of reasonable, rational discourse about it? That's why the First Amendment is the freedom of speech. That's why so many
Hmm.
governments around the world either guarantee, or at least ostensibly, or protect the freedom of speech, is because that's the fundamental basis for a society that isn't just constantly at war with itself, just trying to beat people into submission. And I fear that so many people these days, that's really where they just want to be, is to beat people into submission. Because just forget you. I don't care what you stand for, and I don't care about the systems that you inhabit or espouse. And that's fine. You don't have to care about the systems that I inhabit or espouse. That's precisely my perspective. You don't have to. You can do whatever you want to do. But the thing is, you can't not allow me to have the system that I want to. That's my perspective.
Hmm.
And
Right.
I don't know where the end game is for that crowd, but it's neither here nor there, I guess. Literally.
I'm not sure that the crowd that you're referring to has an end game. Now, there might be an end game that manipulators
Yeah,
have,
that's a good way to put it.
but I think the actors, the
Hmm.
direct actors, the lowest level actors, um, are um, there for the moment and the bandwagon, so to speak, right? And the
Well,
sad
for the
part,
social
and
credit, it's for social credit and for
right,
the intoxication of the moment.
right, well said, well said. And the sad part is, they're not only trying to drown out any opposition, they're actually also drowning out those that I believe have legitimate points to make and want to have dialogue
Sure.
with those that disagree. Right. I mean,
Well,
I
I mean,
think the
trying to find a way forward, right? That's the thing. It's
Mhm.
like, let's be honest about trying to find a better way forward instead of just saying no. I mean, like, it's not that they're just saying no. It's that they're saying um, uh, any progress we've made thus far is not good enough, so we're not going to take any of it, and that just blows my mind.
Right, right. Don't fix it. Throw it out. Yeah.
Right.
The sad part. And again, I keep going back, looping back to this. When I think of that situation, those situations, those circumstances, and those behaviors, it's obvious that there's a right versus wrong argument there. And I don't mean morally right, morally wrong. What I'm talking about
Yeah.
is it's a violation of basic human rights. And I know, and I'm not trying to make the argument. I'm not talking about the civil rights movement of the '60s and the Black Lives Matter. I'm not referring to those kinds of rights. I'm referring to the humanity, the basic human rights, and in the absolute right versus wrong, right? The do no harm right. And as long as it doesn't harm anyone, I should say, not do no harm, as long as it doesn't harm someone else, it's clear. I mean, and no matter what end of the spectrum or what portion of the spectrum, politically, socially, that you embrace and espouse, it happens that way. I mean, and there's not just both, but we refer to it as both, left and right. Right? There's more to it than that.
Sure.
But they all they everyone is to involved is guilty to an extent of doing what the others what they're accusing the others of. Right.
Oh, sure,
I mean,
sure.
so it's a noisy echo chamber where they hear their own stories. It's a noisy echo chamber where no one hears anyone else's stories.
Yeah.
Right. They only hear their own and no one else's. And the sad part is that I think it's a simpler approach. There is a simpler approach. I don't have the answer, and it's not what I'm trying to espouse here
Yeah, yeah.
to how to fix the things that are broken. But I'm just saying from a basic humanity perspective, it's simple. It's simple, and getting people to get that. Anyway, I think we've deviated from rights, but I think we've had a really good deep uh, 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 journey here on this particular thing, and it's taken us down some side roads that have been very exciting.
I think we've gotten
Um,
to the law aspect, right? That's kind of what we're butting up against the law side of the rights, and less on specifically the rights themselves.
Absolutely, and I think the law is actually a big portion of the problem. With the clarity of right and of rights and right in our present time. As I said earlier, all with good intent, right? That the
I don't think all with good
excuse me.
intent.
I agree. I was stopping. There was a lot was good intent, right? To,
Yeah.
to to make it clearer and better. And I mean, even if we don't agree that it's all, I would like to think, and this is my assumed positive intent point of view trying to come through. Even those that it appears to be, self-serving and not right, in assuming, selfish and or other ulterior motives. Um, I would like to think that most of the legislators uh, think they're trying to do the right thing, uh, whether everyone else does or anyone else does or not. So uh, don't know the answer. I guess, and I think I've said this before. I think back, and I mean, the poor man has passed on, but Rodney King during the Los Angeles riots, or right after them, there was just horrible, tension and violence and what all, and he was on television, and I actually heard the man say this. He says, almost in a tearful fashion, he says, "Can't we all just get along?" And it doesn't seem like anyone wants to get along, right? And or many don't want to get along, uh, and that's a sad commentary on our times, because that could be uh, the start of beginning to address um, the situations that we see so much of every day now.
I think you're absolutely right about that. One thing I would say is that I think many people want us all to get along. I think that and I don't want to dig into this at all, but I think there's two
Hmm.
fundamental problems that we're dealing with, and that is one, a system of perverse incentives, and two, a system of indoctrination that and I'll just use this one example that that I heard recently. I heard it secondhand. So the guy I was hearing it from, this was on a documentary. He was quoting someone else, but and the indoctrination system I'm referring to is to some people it wouldn't be surprised for somebody to refer to it this, for others it would be. It was just the education system, so government
Hmm.
education system. He
Sure.
says, imagine if we had all education run by Walmart. And from the time that someone goes into school until the time they graduate high school, they're always talking about the founders of Walmart and how the first one, he could never tell a lie, and and then all these other myths about these different wonderful leaders of Walmart throughout the years, and all everything but the ins and outs of how great Walmart is and how it runs and how the systems that it runs are just the best, and this, that, and the other. And then by the time they get out, you find that, wow, all these kids, they really love Walmart, and you wonder why. It's like, well,
Hmm.
okay, well, no wonder that's the case, right? I mean, it's propaganda. It's at least at some degree, right? And so propaganda works. We know that's true. And so why
Sure.
do we think that it's going to be any different putting people through a system that, you know, espouses all of the supposedly wonderful features of a system that right now just does not work the way that it was intended to, one, and then two, not only not the way it was intended to, it's so perverted and manipulated and just corrupt. It's like how it's you couldn't even draw a caricature of the systems we have that would be more caricaturized than what it actually is versus what it was intended to be.
Hmm.
So, well, I mean, you could, but I mean, it would be hard. That's my
Hmm.
point is that, we all have this context that we come at life with, and we believe that that's the only context there is, and that anything beyond that's just wrong or just not possible. And unfortunately, I think so many people who get caught up into these power systems never take 5 minutes, let alone any significant amount of time to try to step outside of that perspective and context that they were, handed on a plate.
So so what you're saying then is that we all are living in the Truman Show, right? You know, the Jim Carrey movie where it was a show of a cast of people all around him, and he didn't know it. It was his reality, right?
Yeah,
And so when we think in terms of the scenario you said of indoctrination, through the educational system, that's their reality. But then there are those actors around it that are continuing to support and reinforce that reality,
there's a
quote
better
unquote
there's a
reality.
better metaphor comparison. I would say it's like the Matrix, where
Okay,
there's this world that's constructed, and you're taught that it's a certain way, but the reality is behind it, it's really not that way. It's a completely different world.
sure, sure, yeah.
And I don't mean to be conspiracy minded about it, and that's not what I mean at all. Because I mean, I think a lot of it is not by intentional conspiracy. I think it's things where, like, people, you have unintentional coordination. We know that happens all the time. That happens all the time in organic systems.
Hmm.
And then there's just things that arise out of natural systems that when systems get to a certain size, certain things start happening. That's even true in like biology and all kinds of like hard sciences too. So it's like, it's not a special feature of any of the systems we have in our world today. It's just that's a feature of reality. And so thinking that it's
Sure.
different than what it really is I think this disconnect between reality and their people's perceptions problematic.
Yeah, I heard someone make a statement, and it might have been you once before. That is it really a conspiracy theory if it's true?
Oh,
You know,
sure.
and so I think that's in some rudimentary way is what I hear you saying, right? That
Right. Yeah.
these circumstances exist and they've occurred. Now, whether or not someone sit down and put a big plan in motion for this to happen, or
Right.
if it happened through an organic method, it still nevertheless happens and happened, and I think we're seeing a lot of those, whether they were intentional or organic. Circumstances have occurred that are leading people to believe and understand and know and recognize. I shouldn't say just believe, but to recognize that these situations are real, right?
Sure.
That and with all due respect to those people that make their living in the governmental educational system, as human beings, you do respect to them. It's hard to argue that students are not being indoctrinated in some fashion,
Oh,
and it may not be for intentional nefarious purposes,
sure.
but then again, it could. Right? I mean,
Well,
it's
all you have to do is look at history and learn, a thimbleful of history outside of what you'd learn in school to know that there's a narrative in what you learn in school. Now,
sure.
is that narrative in mathematics as damaging as the narrative in history? Nah, probably not, because math doesn't really concern itself with things other than understanding what you're looking at. But problem with disciplines like history, social sciences, all that is that that's their intent, is to understand things by abstracting from all of these examples into some sort of system of understanding. And when all
Hmm.
your examples are tilted in a certain way, well, of course you're going to abstract to a certain particular point of view.
Hmm.
Anyway, again, I'm not trying to say we're you know we got some puppet master behind the scenes pulling everybody's string or anything, but there's more to it than what most people think or believe. I'm thoroughly convinced of that.
Sure. And here you cannot uh, affect change on anything if you don't spend some time and effort to understand it. And I think that's what we're
Sure.
doing. And while we may be calling out some things that we believe, we've understood, that we've witnessed or seen or experienced, we're trying to call things out in such a way that we can determine from our perspectives and our points of view and our principles of behavior and belief and actions, um, can affect the changes that support. And it's not just ours, but but it's everyone else, right? I mean, this whole thing of
Sure.
right versus wrong, it isn't selfish. It isn't just me, because
No.
I have to believe it as much for you as I do for myself, or it's not. It's not. It doesn't fit the mold. Doesn't fit the principle. So anyway, we could go on for hours.
Certainly.
I think we've hit a point in time where it's good to take a couple of breaths until our next session discussion. Um, Enjoyed this. This is one that's deep, probably the deepest topic we've discussed so far. I think there's a lot more that we can pull out of this and tease out of it over time.
Absolutely.
Quite frankly, I think the reason being, this is the foundation for everything else that you and I think and feel and believe and stand for and want to advocate for. I think.
Yeah, no
I
doubt
believe.
about that. Yep.
All right, sir. It's been real and it's been great, and it has been real great too. So
Yeah, it's a good time.
enjoyed it, enjoyed your company, enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise, Dolan.
Until we meet again,
Sounds good.
have a
We'll
good
see you
evening.
next time. You too.